Welcome to Syntax, a Generative Introduction, 4th edition. My name is Andrew Carnie. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona. I'm the author of your textbook, and I'll be leading you through this series of video tutorials. In this chapter, we're going to discuss parts of speech. This is of interest to syntacticians because we want to know what the items are that we're going to combine together into our sentences. So we're going to look at what are effectively the building blocks of sentences. These are things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, prepositions, and adverbs. They're categories that allow us to tell what items can appear in which position. We care about this because we find that some items can appear in some positions and some items can appear in others, but they don't always overlap. So for example, the sun shines too brightly in Tucson. Sun is a noun and it can appear as the subject of the sentence, whereas a verb like will glow can't appear in that position. We also call parts of speech syntactic categories because they're the categories that syntax manipulates. Now, you might think it's strange for us to cover this topic because a lot of people have an intuitive sense of what these parts of speech are. So, for example, you may have heard of such things as a noun is a person, place, or thing. It's maybe even been drilled into you in school. When I was a kid back in the 70s and 80s, on Saturday mornings we used to have this television show called Schoolhouse Rock. And in Schoolhouse Rock, they had great videos with animations and fantastic music. And they taught you important ideas about grammar, government, and even science. But unfortunately, when it comes to grammar, they were way off track. They were based on very old ideas about what parts of speech and other grammatical categories are. So for example, you can go online into YouTube and search for Schoolhouse Rock, and you'll find a video called A Noun is a Person, Place, or Thing. And it's a lovely video, but it's just deeply, deeply, deeply incorrect. I can't include it here in this video because that would be a violation of copyright, but there's a link there on the screen that you can use, or you can search for it. Now, these classic definitions, these intuitive definitions that you may have learned before, have one thing in common. They are based on semantics. They're based on the meanings of the words. So for example, a noun is a person, place, or thing. So if you look at a word like a doctor, doctor is a person, therefore the word doctor is a noun. Verbs are actions, occurrences, or states of being. Adjectives are modifiers that express quality, quantity, or extent. So all of these are based in the meaning of the word that we're trying to define in terms of part of speech. This next definition is terrifying. If you ever see a definition like this in linguistics, you better grab your wallet and run. Adverbs are modifiers that express manner, quality, place, time, degree, number, cause, opposition, affirmation, or denial. I don't know how you're supposed to think of that as a natural class. Prepositions are modifiers that indicate location or origin. So, as I said before, all of these definitions are based on the semantics of the word. And for the most part, they correctly capture which part of speech a word is. But the problem is that once you start diving into this with a little more rigor and detail, you discover that the edge cases show us that semantics is not really how we're figuring out what a part of speech of a word is. So let's take, for example, the fact that in many languages, you find words that meet one definition but in fact are categories of another. Let's take, for example, the word assassination. By any definition, the word assassination is an action. But clearly in the sentence, the assassination of the president, it's a noun. Similarly, sincerity, because it describes a quality, should be an adjective. But here in this sentence, sincerity is an important quality. It's a noun. To sort of really stretch the example, our definition of a preposition is indicating a location. So take Tucson is where New Yorkers flee for the winter. Clearly, Tucson here is not a preposition. So when we look at these edge cases, we see that the definitions break down a little bit. We also see this when we look at words with either identical or very closely related meanings that can have multiple parts of speech. So for example, the word father can be a verb, it can be a noun, and with a little bit of a stretch, it can even be an adjective. The meanings are all related to each other, so you would expect that they would have the same part of speech if we define parts of speech using semantics. But in the first sentence, father is a noun, second sentence, father is a verb, and in the third one, it's an adjective. This is compounded when you start comparing languages to each other. So if parts of speech are defined using semantics, then you would expect that a word that means the same thing in two different languages, so for example, the word doctor in English and the word doctor in Irish refer to doctors, right? So that's semantically, we know that they refer to the same thing. You would expect them to always have the same part of speech. But this clearly isn't true. We're going to look at three examples here, one from Irish, one from Quimera, and one from Walbury, that show that the English definitions don't work cross-linguistically. So take Irish here. So in Irish, verbs have a very specific position. Irish is a verb, subject, object order language, VSO. And verbs always appear in a very specific privileged position. They follow certain kinds of particles, like negation. They precede agreement morphology, and they precede subjects. So look at that first sentence in A. I is the verb to eat, and it follows the negative particle ni, and it precedes both the third singular masculine agreement marker and the subject John. So ni han chan. Now, that's where verbs go. Now, if we look at this sentence in B, this is a bit of a surprise, because here we're finding a noun in exactly that position. So we're finding the word doctor between ni and e. It's a different third singular agreement marker, but it is in fact a third singular agreement marker. So ni doctoration. That doctor is appearing before the agreement and the subject, just where verbs do, and it appears after negation, just where verbs do. So doctor here seems to be functioning like a verb, even though its semantics tell us it's a noun. Let's look at Quimera. In Quimera, verbs can be marked with certain prefixes that indicate the subject. So for example, the subject yak marks the first singular. First singular means I. So if you want to say, I don't like this dog or I dislike this dog, you put yak in front of the word for dislike. Now in the B sentence, we should be surprised to see that the same prefix, the one that means I, is attaching itself to what semantically is an adjective. So the word for small has the property of expressing a quality, and it's taking this prefix that only attaches to verbs. So this tells us that something else is going on here. Small, which by semantics should be an adjective, is functioning like a verb. In the Quimera example, small was functioning like a verb. In Walbury, the word for small is functioning like a noun. So in Walbury, which is a language spoken in Australia, the word for small can take the subject marker lu, which is always attached to nouns, always attached to subject-noun phrases. And here you'll see that the word small is appearing in this position. The best English translation we can come up with is something like the small one, but there's no noun one in the Walbury. Instead, what you have is you're just taking that subject marker and sticking it straight onto the word for small. So here, again, the semantics breaks down. It still indicates the quality of being small, but it's functioning like a noun. If you're not convinced, I think this next case will really convince you. Take this sentence filled with made-up words for English. The Yinkish Dripner blurked quastophically into the Ninden with the Pittibs. Now, what's particularly interesting about this sentence is I sincerely hope that none of you know what Yinkish means, or Dripner, or quastophically, or blorked, Pittibs, or Ninden. These are all made-up words. So you cannot know what the semantics of them are. You cannot know what their reference is. Nevertheless, every native speaker of English will tell you that Yinkish is an adjective, that Dripner is a noun, blorked is a verb, quastophically is an adverb, and both Ninden and Pittibs are nouns. How did we know this if we don't know what they mean? How do you know what Dripner is if you don't know what a Dripner is? How can you tell if it's a person or a place or thing? The answer to this is we don't actually use semantics to figure out parts of speech. Instead, what we're looking at and referring to are the affixes, that means the suffixes and prefixes, and the syntactic position of the words that we're looking at. So for example, Yinkish has on it this ish suffix. That's a typical suffix for adjectives. Dripner ends in er. That's a common suffix on nouns. We also note that Dripner follows Yinkish, which we've deduced to be an adjective, and the article the. This is a very typical position for nouns to appear in. Blorked is taking the ed suffix, which we take to be a past tense marker, and it's following the subject. Again, this is a very typical position for verbs. Quastophically has got that ly suffix. That tells us it's probably an adverb. Ninden is immediately appearing after an article. That's a typical position for nouns. Pittibs, that's true for Pittibs too, and Pittibs also has this suffix s, which suggests to us that whatever a Pittib is, there's more than one of them. So we use these suffixes and we use the syntactic position to figure out what the part of speech is, even though we don't know what these words mean. So that tells us that the semantic definitions, a noun is a person, place, or thing, a verb is an action, occurrence, or a state of being, those kinds of definitions are, while intuitive, are almost certainly wrong. So, there's one more point I want to make before we talk about how we actually define parts of speech, which is that there's a whole set of words which don't really have a meaning in the sense that they don't have a reference. Instead, they have a function. So they have a grammatical purpose, but they don't actually have something you can point to in the world or identify in our imaginations. We only use them to stick the bits of a sentence together. These are function words. So take, for example, that, of, and for in the sentences on this slide. You'll see that those underlined words don't have a classic meaning. Instead, what they have is a function. What they do is stick the sentence together. So in I think that Jose is in the kitchen, that is a complementizer, which functions to stick one clause inside of another. And of is a preposition that links two noun phrases together. Okay, so what kinds of definitions are we actually going to use to determine what a part of speech is? The definitions that syntacticians use are distributional. What we care about is what affix is attached to the word and what syntactic contexts the word appears in. Now, it goes without saying, because languages differ in what affixes they have and how their syntaxes are structured, these parts of speech definitions are all going to be language specific. So the parts of speech definitions for Irish, Quimera, and Walbury are going to be different than those for English. Okay, so we really have two kinds of distribution we've looked at. I've hinted at this before. There's morphological distribution, which refers to what the affixes on the word are, and there's syntactic distribution, which is the position of the word relative to nearby words. I want to stop here for a second and ask you to think critically about one thing that we have talked about. I started this discussion with the observation that we care about parts of speech because they tell us where in the sentence particular words can appear. But now I've just defined parts of speech in terms of where the words appear. Ask yourselves whether this is a circular fact or not. Have I done some circular argumentation by saying we need to know what the part of speech something is by where it appears, and then defining the part of speech by where it appears? Logically, it's a bit of a circular argument, but in fact, in practicality, it's really just describing two sides of the same fact, that certain words appear in certain positions. Okay, now we can list the distributions for any particular language for particular parts of speech. So for example, in English, nouns have particular morphological distributions. They take particular kinds of derivational suffixes. These are suffixes that turn words into nouns, so things like ship and ist and ness and hood. Those are all suffixes that indicate that the word we're looking at is a noun. Similarly, we have inflectional suffixes like the plural suffix s. You have to be a little careful with the plural s, though, because s and its variants also show up on verbs. But interestingly, when it shows up on verbs, it means the exact opposite. It means singular. It means third person singular. So for example, dogs, the s, the z or s that you hear on dogs marks the plural. But if I say he eats, the s there actually indicates that it's third person singular. So just be a little careful with that test. We also can look at the syntax. So for example, articles appear before nouns. Adjectives appear before nouns. Noun phrases follow prepositions. Noun phrases can appear as the subjects or direct objects of sentences. And if you're going to negate a noun as opposed to negating a whole sentence, you use no instead of not. Now, it's possible to do this for any part of speech. We can do verbs, adjectives, adverbs, etc. We can do lists like this. I'll show you them very quickly. If you're actually interested, you could pause the video and look at what's listed on each of the slides. But you shouldn't try to memorize these. You should just understand that these are the kinds of criteria that we can use for determining parts of speech. So here are some of the criteria we can use for verbs. I won't go through these in too much detail. Similarly, here are some criteria that we can use for adjectives. And here are some criteria that we can use for adverbs. Again, don't memorize these. Don't try and learn them. But understand how they function and how they allow us to identify something as a part of speech when not relying upon the meaning of the word. Okay, to summarize, what we've talked about in this video is that we care about parts of speech because they form the building blocks of sentences. They tell us which words appear in which positions. The classic definitions of these parts of speech, while intuitively correct, are highly problematic. They don't catch the edge cases. They don't capture cross-linguistic cases, and they don't allow us to understand how we can actually identify a part of speech without knowing the meaning of that sentence. Those classic definitions are all based in meaning. Linguistically, instead, what we can do is look at their distribution, both in terms of their morphological distribution and their syntactic distribution. In the next video, we're going to talk about functional parts of speech and how we might identify those.